Hi there, Year 10. Um, I hope you're doing well and keeping cheerful and you've had a good week. Thanks once again for your comments through this week on the poem Cory in the Winter from this book, Love's Loose Ends by David Tate. I think, if anything, it was probably a slightly harder poem to do than In Paris With You. So it's a really good effort. People have raised some really interesting interpretations and questions. So we'll be going through all of those today for our last lesson of the week, as well as making some connections to last week's poem as well. So best way to start is to read the poem. So we'll get it up on screen here, and we'll have a read through. So it's Cory and the Winter. I knew it would stick, so I woke up early to put on my coat and wrote you a sonnet in the snow. I staked the first claim of your street's snowflake footprints, then sketched it on the rooftops of 4 cars, the chalk crunch as I traced white words on metal, looping letters that curled precise for your eyes. When you opened the blinds, it would melt your cold heart. Though of course it didn't work out like this. The woman next door drove off with stanza 2, and I watched by the hedge as the blizzard summoned day, and school kids took the couplet for a man made of snow. Your sonnet in the snow glowed pale below the moon, though your curtains never opened, they had melted by noon. Okay, so as a starting point, I think it's worth thinking about some of the symbols in the poem, or the key images in the poem, and some of those are on the screen here. Obviously, you've got the idea of snow, and snow as something that can be beautiful, can be a symbol for sort of purity, freshness, but also something that doesn't last, something that melts, and something that's cold as well, and can bring with it its own forms of danger and pain. Along with the natural image of the snow and other natural images like the moon, for example, you've also got sort of man-made images, in particular the car, and maybe another man-made image, although different from the car, is the image of the sonnet. The writer, or rather the speaker, describes writing the sonnet in the snow, but the poem itself is also a kind of sonnet. We'll talk a bit about the form of the poem. So you've got a sonnet, something that's man-made and constructed, and a car, something that's man-made and constructed, but very different sort of things. A sonnet is something artistic, romantic. Sonnets are traditionally love poems. It's something that's sort of crafted in that way, whereas a car, something that's much more modern, whereas a sonnet is traditional, something that's utilitarian, we use it to get places, whereas the sonnet perhaps is something that adorns life rather than being useful in and of itself. So a dichotomy to think about there. Then you've got the blind or the curtains that remain shut, that sort of blockage between the two people in the poem. It mentions noon, and you've got this idea of time running out perhaps in the poem. And time running out is often an idea that's associated in literature. If we go back through the ages, through the centuries with the moon can be a symbol for that, as well as having its own connotations of magic and romance and so on. So lots of you picked up on one or more of these symbols or images in your comments that you sent. I thought it was just worth talking about those a little bit now before we look at the poem and at your comments in a little bit more detail. Okay, so obviously central theme of the poem is love, as last week, and you can see here some of the classic suggestions for what is the poem saying about love, and what image do we get as well. Another question I asked you of the relationship between speaker and the addressee in this poem. So you can read those on the screen. I won't read out every word there that's in front of you, but I think to pick out a few sort of key points that came up multiple times, and these are mostly quotes from what students said in your messages, but they're not exhaustive. So you might have said something similar, but not exactly in these words. You've got this idea about one-sided affection, unrequited love, and the pain that's associated with that. You've got the idea about this relationship as something that's fading. The idea, the poem is slowly taken away bit by bit, and the speaker's hope is disappearing bit by bit. And this links to the idea of love as something that's temporary or fleeting or something that doesn't last. And sometimes it isn't meant to be, which a number of students picked up on. There's one at the bottom of my screen here, but I'm not sure if it's coming through on the video. It might be just cut off the bottom of your screen. This idea as well, love is fleeting, yes, and also it often goes unseen. So here we have in this poem a performance, if you like, of love, but the person who it's intended for doesn't see it. And I think that's an idea about love in the poem, the idea of love as being something that remains unseen or unknown. Okay, so we'll have a look more closely at the text of the poem. We'll go through stanza by stanza, and I'll go through some of the comments that you made and answer some questions along the way as well. But I think it's worth talking a little bit before we sort of dig into that about the structure of the poem and this idea about the fact that we're dealing with sonnets. The image on the screen there is the first edition of Shakespeare's sonnets, which, unlike his plays, were sort of published and sold in book form in his lifetime. A sonnet is a kind of poem that's originally invented in Italy, but Shakespeare was one of the writers who popularised it in this country. So sonnet is a poem of 14 lines, and here we've got 14 lines. You can see 3 stanzas of 4 lines and then a last stanza of 2 lines, which is a structure that we often see in an English sonnet. Sonnets tend to be about love, and particularly about eternal love. And here, obviously, we have a love poem in sonnet form, but not a poem about love that lasts. And of course, we're actually dealing with 2 sonnets, aren't we, here? Because the speaker writes a sonnet and then tells us about that in sonnet form, different sonnet. One student picked up on the idea that sonnets can come in different shapes and sizes, but if we're being strict about what a sonnet is in English poetry, it's got a particular rhyme scheme, which we don't see in this poem. We have a rhyming couplet at the end, which sonnets tend to have, but the previous stanzas don't rhyme. There's not rhymes at the end of the lines, which traditionally in a sonnet there would be. And one student suggested, which I thought was quite interesting, is here we have then an attempt at a sonnet, but not quite a sonnet, a different kind of a sonnet. And maybe this idea then, if a sonnet represents this idealised notion of love, here we have in this poem a nearly sonnet for nearly love, something that is approaching this perfect form but doesn't quite make it. So that's another view of love potentially in this poem. I thought that was a really nice point, that we get something that looks like a sonnet and attempts the idea of a sonnet but doesn't quite make it, in a way that the love between the speaker and the addressee, who we assume is Cory, doesn't quite make it either. Okay, so having talked about the structure, let's go to the start of this poem. So I knew it would stick. A couple of people picked out this line to comment on, and it's an interesting first phrase to the poem, because as a couple of you pointed out, it could refer to a couple of different things. I knew it would stick. Snow's going to stick. It's going to lie on the ground. It's not going to melt. But also this relationship could be being described here. I knew it would stick. The speaker's confidence about his future with this other person. So you've got that double meaning, or that association from the start of the poem set up between snow and the relationship. They're kind of paired by the fact that this first phrase could refer to either of them. And I think that's quite sort of an important idea in terms of understanding this poem. So I woke up early to put on my coat and wrote you a sonnet in the snow. What Another thing about structure that people sort of pointed out, or one student pointed out, is that these lines at the start are quite short lines. If you look as the poem goes on, the lines get longer. And one person suggested that these initial lines reflect a kind of excitement in the speaker. They're easily excited, almost childishly excited about wanting to show their love for this person, and so they rush into this idea of writing this sonnet. But now, as the poem goes on, the lines get longer, and that reflects this idea that the reality is more complex. So you get this simple, excited view of love at the start, but it gives way to this more complex reality as the lines get longer. One student asked about the word staked here in the first stanza, and asked, why does the writer use that particular word there? And I thought that was an interesting question, because there's more than one meaning of that word staked. Staking a claim is the phrase that we can see here in this line. And if you stake a claim to something, you claim it as your own. You say, this is mine, and traditionally that is to do with land. You might claim some land. Explorers or colonists would stake a claim to the land that they'd discovered, or the land that they'd travelled to. So that's one meaning here, the idea this person's claiming the snow and saying, here, look, this is mine. I'm going to have it, I'm going to use it for my poem. But another meaning of stake, or another use of the word stake that you might be familiar with, is the idea of a stakeout, or staking something out, and that refers to surveillance, like the police might stake out a property, for example, or an invading army might stake out a strategic point. So if you're staking something out, you're surrounding it and observing it, possibly with an intent to then perform some sort of hostile action. So you've got different sets of connotations here about that word staked. But what's interesting, I thought, I hadn't really considered this before the student who asked this question brought it up, but the connotations in both cases are actually quite negative. Staking a claim to the land, it's almost like this other person is something to be claimed, an object or a property, not very romantic. Or a stakeout, observing, almost spying on someone, again, not very romantic. I think it's quite interesting here that we've got a speaker who we're invited mostly in the poem to sympathise with, but then this word staked here gives us a sort of more negative, maybe frisson to the poem. And I found that quite interesting. So a couple of people picked up on here the idea that he's writing out this sonnet, this expression of love, in snow, and of course, as we've mentioned, snow doesn't last. So there's the idea of that relationship, or that love, as itself being temporary. Second stanza was the stanza that fewest people commented on or asked questions about. You can see in this stanza the speaker is writing out his poem across 4 cards, one for each stanza of his sonnet. There's just a couple of words I want to pick out of that stanza before we move on. You've got the verb, or you've been used as a noun here, in fact, crunch at the end of that first line. Not a soft or romantic word. Again, maybe this idea there's a romantic gesture going on, but there's something more sort of negative in the background. And also the verb traced in the second line of that stanza. I found that verb interesting because if you trace something, you're normally making a copy of something. It's not an original. And so maybe we get this idea that this gesture isn't original or isn't truly from the heart, but it's a performance or a copy of someone else's idea of love. I'm going to pause there for a few minutes, so I'll see you for the second half of the poem in part 2.